gender differences as a nice, safe answer. In order to study gender differences, you have to have twice as many people to split by that. So we had pretty much balanced male-female ratio in our studies, and it's something that we get asked about a lot and we're interested in, but we haven't seen how it is different for suppression. I usually get asked the question that men seem to ignore everything, and no, the sexual slant, but at least that side of it. And, it might be true, and we have not studied it.
So we're going to take 2 more questions and then take a break. So if you've had your hand up, I will get you after the break.
No, sure.
Oh, she already asked her question, so...
Hi. I was noticing that the older people, they were responding higher when they were trying to ignore something than when they were trying to just passively view it. And I was wondering why that was.
There's actually no statistical difference. So that's just some variances. It's basically the same. The amount of activity when they're passively viewing and ignoring it are different, while the younger subjects seem to actually actively suppress below that passive level. And if you look at the passive levels and do the direct comparison, there's no difference between young and old. The difference is really in the activity for ignoring.
Quick question. Are there a lot of labs in this area of research? Or is this a pretty unique kind of are we on the edge right now?
I think this is largely my own slant on it. I wouldn't say I was the only lab. There's a lot of labs that looked at this aspect of inhibition and aging from the psychological perspective. So a lot of psychologists over the last 20 years have been talking about this. Lynn Hasher is now a friend of mine, since she was the strong advocate of this theory that was not... It was very controversial. I think that we resolved a lot of the controversy. The problem is when you're looking at this from the perspective of a psychologist, where your only measures are behavioral measures, you can't really see what's occurring when someone's ignoring something because there's no measure that's associated with that. You can only see the indirect effects of that. By using brain activity, we can actually see during the moment of ignoring that ignoring's not taking place. So Lynn Hasher, who is really this proponent of this inhibitory deficit hypothesis, was very happy to hear these results because it sort of pulled it together.
Would giving more time change the results? So you said that it was the first 0.2 of a second. So if you gave them, for example, 30 seconds, would those 29 8/10 ever overcome the first 0.2?
It very well might. There's a study that was out quite a while ago, but a behavioral study that showed that differences in remembering information seem to be balanced when the older adults had more time, and a lot of it is due to the speed of processing change. It might be. It's a good question.
It's time for a break. It's stuck up there. I need you guys to do me 2 favors. If you have an empty tray, a glass, can you take it up to the front up here in the corner underneath these lights? We'll be taking about a 10-minute break. We'll come back. The rest of the time we're going to spend is just Dr. Gazzaley answering your questions.
Recently, but I haven't seen anything more convincing that's come up since then. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen like a really nice, clean study of that.
Trey.
No.
Okay. I believe it's your turn.
Thanks. I too am a neuroscientist, but I'm not at his lab, despite what was claimed earlier. Anyway, so I work with a lot of genetic mutants, and sometimes we get mutants that are actually better at stuff. Like they have some sort of a gene that makes them less fat or live longer. Have you noticed that in people, there are super old people that are just awesome, like young people?
Hang on before you answer that. True. So we are in a bar, so this is a great conversation. Can you describe what a genetic mutant is? Because what I'm thinking is Wolverine. And, I don't think that's what you're talking about.
Right. So sometimes there are certain genes that, as biologists, discover, and we find that they confer either, when they work or when they don't work, they either improve the life or some function of the animal in some way, or make it worse. So for example, some genes, if they're mutants, they make cancer, and some genes, if they're mutants, they have diabetes.
Oh, superhuman. Yeah. So there's another aspect of aging that I didn't talk about called successful aging, and we're all familiar with this. It's that 90-year-old that you meet and you're like, wow, this person's smarter than I am and more sharp, and Probably most people have had that experience, and there are a lot of people in that group, although not a tremendous number. And I think it's a really interesting avenue for research. If you know anyone in this group, let me know. We're going to be putting an ad in the Chronicle probably in the next couple months, looking for these people to figure out if there's a clue here about how we can age quite that well. Okay, I just have a couple more slides. I forgot this one that I think is fun. The last slide of the talk, actually, and then I'm going to go on to a new topic, and there's only like 5 slides. So this concept of the prefrontal cortex being a bouncer, which is determining exactly which information is getting in, and thinking about the areas of your brain that you store information as being like sort of like a nightclub. And clearly the nightclub of our memory, our working memory, is not quite this large, right? So we know that for things like digits, it's only 7, which is on average, which is probably might have some relationship to why phone numbers are possible to remember, where if they were 15 digits long, like your credit card numbers, you probably would not be remembering them. But it's actually much shorter, your working memory capacity, for other things. So for visual objects, it's only like 4, and depending on how complicated it is, it might even be like 2. So we're looking at a much smaller zone here, and then this area of your brain is basically deciding what gets in and what doesn't get in. And when this malfunctions and too much information gets in here, it causes interference, and that's what causes the deficits we're seeing. I didn't get asked the most frequent question that I'm asked, and I figure with that many questions I would probably have been asked it, but I'll ask it to myself then. What happens to children, especially those with ADHD? Okay? Was anyone going to ask that question? Anyway, so we don't know. We're doing a study right now with colleagues at Berkeley where we have 28 to 12-year-olds that have done this experiment, same exact experiment, and they actually do not show a suppression deficit like the older subjects. Now, it might be that children that are more prone to attention problems might show it. Whether or not children that have ADHD have a selective suppression deficit like our older subjects, we don't know the answer to that, and that's something that we are interested in. But once again, that this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the bouncer in this image over here, is not, it's the part that's evolved the most, as I showed you in that slide, but it's also the part that develops the latest. So we know that the connections between this part and the rest of the brain, the myelination, is the last to occur. It doesn't even occur until people are in their 20s and maybe even older sometimes. So you can see how children are so bottom-up driven, right? They might have a goal, you present them with something else, and they're off on a new goal, right? So that's the bottom-up. So again, top-down control might change as you get older, but it's also something that takes time to develop, and any parents are probably well aware of that. All right. So this is a very important topic that probably some of you might have even come out here because of to think or hear something about this. I wish we were further along in our understanding about what to do here, but a lot of our decisions on this depend on what I just told you, right? Understanding what's changing in the brain, what's going wrong, so that we have a foothold, that we know where to act therapeutically. I'm going to tell you about some things that we do think work. A lot of it is based on epidemiological studies, which are okay, but they don't tell you for sure that this is what's doing it, right? It could be another factor. It doesn't apply causality. Sometimes epidemiological studies don't translate. You might think something's having an influence because you look at a population and they have what you think is one factor different, and they have something that's helped about them. And then when you do a study, a case-controlled study, where you give that factor or that element to one group and not to another group, you sometimes don't see a difference. And that's the best way to determine if something's working. So some of this evidence is still loose, but I don't think any of this stuff is very harmful. So I'm going to tell you at least where we're going and what the current sort of state is. So nutrition, we used to think that nutrition was just good for the body. We now are gaining more evidence that even thinking of the brain as part of a body is certainly a fine way to think about nutrition and its impact. The Mediterranean diet, low-calorie diet, there's a large literature on animal models of calorie restriction increasing the length of life. It does appear that these animals are not just living longer, but they actually are fairly healthy later into life. So nuts and fish and vegetables, fruits, red wine, and everyone is very excited to see that on the list, and olive oil are certainly all associated in keeping saturated fats low is important as well. And nuts. Oh yeah, whole grains, sorry. That's my nutritional consult right there. Physical exercise. So again, lots of evidence about exercise and keeping the brain healthy. So again, not just for your heart, but for your brain, probably due to changes in the vascular system, but also, as I mentioned before, probably also due to direct changes on nerve growth factors. So both aerobic training and weight training have both been found to be helpful. Mental exercise. So this question came up early on. So crossword puzzles, although they have been often touted as something that keeps the brain healthy, I'm not a strong advocate of. I don't think that this is the type of exercise that your brain maximally demands in pulling old esoteric pieces of information. But if you enjoy doing it, by all means go ahead. But I think that the evidence is rather weak that this keeps your brain healthy. Without getting into too much trouble with Nintendo, although I did give a comment of this to Wired Magazine that somehow did not appear, I think that there's no evidence that brain age and a lot of the brain training games out there do help the brain. Now, I don't think that they hurt the brain, and they may help, but a lot of studies have not been done on how these different devices work or not work. So I think it's important to realize that, and there's certainly nothing wrong with doing things that you enjoy and things that might give your brain more exercise than not doing anything. But there's still a lot of evidence missing, so that's all. There are companies like Posit Science that I'll give a thumbs up to. We have a collaboration with them. I like this company. I like other companies that do the type of studies that we do for drugs, right? So you have an intervention that you design, and you give a whole bunch of people intervention. You have a whole group of controls, and you follow them over time, and you see if there's a real benefit. And a lot of the posits, their auditory has really shown some benefit, as well as other companies, like companies that design the speed of processing training. So there is a lot to be said about focused training of different neural processes. We're in the process right now of designing. I have some colleagues here that are working with me in designing a video game that's selectively focused on suppression. So the idea is that we could teach you how to ignore better, since we know that's the problem, especially in older adults. And if you can ignore better, you should remember better. At least that's the idea. So we're now looking into funding projects to design our own cognitive training to improve these processes that we know are declining. Another thing is stepping out of the comfort zone. Right? So maybe this is a little too large of a leap, but I think it's the right idea, is that you have to keep, especially older adults, have to keep their brains active by not allowing themselves to become too comfortable. I frequently keep bringing up sitting on the couch watching TV. I think that is certainly something that hurts. Social engagement, even with one other person, certainly in a group, these are the type of dynamic interactions that build your working memory and other skills. Travel, again, way out of your comfort zone. You're forced to do many different types of sort of dynamic manipulations. These are the things that we really recommend in addition to the more formal training. What we're doing in our lab is we are doing brain recording experiments before an intervention. So we're actually looking at the medication that we use to treat Alzheimer's disease with and see if it helps improve people's suppression abilities. So we have a lot of evidence that this medication, which is a cholinesterase inhibitor and increases the level of acetylcholine in the brain that acts on attention, might actually be acting on top-down modulation and improving suppression, leading to better memory as a secondary consequence. So we're investigating this. We have a collaboration, as I said, with Posit, where we plucked out one of their modules from their brain training program. We're doing our brain recording before, and then we do these interventions, and then we do our brain recording after. So people have not really done this, but it's a way of integrating how we use our tools to understand how the brain works, to understand what we can do to help the brain. Right? So we know what's changing, and now we can look at the brain and see, are we changing it back? And if we're not, what do we have to do to hit it in the right way so that it gets better? So this is a new sort of way of using these tools, and we're pretty excited about our experiments on it. Another goal is that we'll be able to look at the brain activity before someone does a training or a drug experiment, let's say, and then see the results afterwards and be able to calculate a neural profile that predicts their success in a certain training program. So if we do this with enough different interventions, soon we'll have a neural profile we could say, just sort of like a physical fitness trainer might take you through the gym on your first visit and see what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then custom make a tailor-made program to those strengths and weaknesses. So we'll be able to see by looking at your brain what you actually need and what has been shown based on this profile that leads to the maximal efficacy from an intervention. So this is really our goals, is to have people come in the future, be able to evaluate where they are by looking at these brain recordings, and then make an intervention along with the other lifestyle factors that we talked about, and then see the outcomes. Okay, that's all I have for slides. I'd like to thank you for your attention and your lack of attention on other things, if that was possible. Assistants and postdocs, our collaborators, Daria for her nutritional consult, grad students, and all our funding agencies on the bottom. So if you have any questions that we have not...
We're going to start in the back here. And I encourage everyone not to just ask a question, but make a comment. Maybe you've eaten something, maybe you really think crossword puzzles are great, and you want to tell Adam to go to hell. Whatever it is, this is your time to make your comments and I have your questions. First question.
Hi, I work in the mental health field, and I've come across many individuals who've suffered trauma, some form of trauma in their childhood or adolescence, and develop hypervigilance as a result of having to constantly scan their environment for safety. I'm wondering if you have any data on people who've suffered trauma and any suppression deficits they may have that may perhaps be even worse than older participants?
We haven't done any research on that, but traumatic brain injury, TBI, is a very common cause of cognitive deficits. And, I think that anything that affects the frontal lobes will cause these type of problems. So it depends where the traumatic brain injury is. But a lot of them are to the frontal lobes. And when you fall, if you fall on your back, you get a contour injury, it's called, and you could damage the front part of your brain. And that could cause a suppression deficit. So it's pretty common. And you could see this, what we call disinhibition, this acting out, this inability to control your social behavior very frequently after brain injuries.
I was meaning more emotional trauma.
Oh, emotional trauma, like the type that leads to PTSD. Yeah, so that's, everyone knows PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So people that have experienced intense emotional trauma often have this. So that I have theories about that, but we haven't done experiments. So things like PTSD and obsessive compulsive disorder, I tend to think that those are also suppression problems, but a different type of suppression problem, because what we've been focusing on right now is suppression of the world around you and things that are irrelevant, but there's also a whole internal world, and sometimes it needs to be suppressed, right? So inability to suppress thoughts, either recurrent thoughts or traumatic thoughts, can also lead to a decrease in function as well. We hear that all the time. So the ability to regulate your internal world as well as your external world are all part of this, and I think they're all mediated by this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex.
Just a quick question before we move on to somebody else's question. Where are we sort of curve of this research? Are we at the infancy of learning about, or are we moving far along? Are we in the adolescent stage? Do we know a lot about memory at this point?
Yeah, so it depends how optimistic you are. The brain is massively complicated, right? It's the most complicated structure we know of in the universe, and it proves it to us every time we try to study it. It just seems to get bigger and bigger. So I wouldn't say we're at infancy, but I wouldn't say we're way beyond that. A lot of it is perspective. We frequently change theories, and we have different ways of looking at things, and it's not always like the old ones are wrong. There's just new interpretations. So I think we have a long way to go. Whether or not we're even capable of fully understanding our own brains is certainly a philosophical question that's been raised, and I believe that there might be limits on what we can understand. But and certainly in terms of diseases of the brain, we really don't know as much as I wish we did right now.
Hi there, I work with nutritional supplements, and I was just wondering what you know about specific nutrients, their effects on the brain, and also like smart drugs that have been popularized in Europe.
Yeah, so...
before you go, so what do you believe in, and how well do you think these work?
Well, I'm not too sure. I haven't really taken any myself, so I'm wondering your opinion.
Have you heard anything from people that take it
I mean, I know tons of older people who are very dependent on their supplements, so it works for them.
And they take it why?
For memory, most of the time.
So is this a huge industry, like people taking supplements for memory?
This is a huge industry in general, even outside of memory. And I'm not going to totally bash the supplement industry right now, but
we've had a former speaker do that, so feel free.
I would say that there is a lack of convincing, controlled studies that show efficacy of a lot of supplements. I think omega-3s recently have had some really nice evidence that is more convincing than not. A lot of times these substances are not regulated by the FDA, so the dosages of the different supplements vary. They don't have the same controls that medications have. I think for the most part they're probably not harmful, but I don't really advocate it for the most part. About the memory enhancing drugs, the medication that we treat Alzheimer's with, the cholinesterase inhibitors, when they came out, they were called cognitive enhancers, and that's all they do is boost the acetylcholine system, which is one of the main neurotransmitter systems in the brain. And a lot of these medications that are considered sort of memory cognitive enhancers really just boost natural neurotransmitters. So right now, the boosting of cognitive ability in younger people using medications is not very encouraging. There's a phenomenon in pharmacology known as the inverted U. Is anyone familiar with this? Any pharmacologists here? So for the dopamine system, I wish I had a blackboard here. So you picture an upside down U like this. And the peak of it over here, we could use this. The peak of it over here is optimal performance. This is the amount of dopamine, right? So you could be at optimal performance over here. Now, if you have a deficiency of dopamine, and this is done in animals, and you start off over here, taking more dopamine helps, right? But if you're already at optimal level and you take more, what happens is that you go down the other side and you actually get worse. And so that we see that taking more is not necessarily a good thing, even if it's a good thing in some people. So we see a lot of that, and it might be true of the cholinergic system too. So it's not necessarily very straightforward to think about boosting natural neurotransmitters in very healthy young people with normal levels into a better state. And it really hasn't panned out. But there are a lot of people that are still investigating, if there was a type of sort of mental steroid that people could have, and certainly it would be attached with a lot of ethical and social issues if we had that.
So we've dispensed with the artificial improvements, but you had mentioned both diet and exercise earlier. I was wondering about the short-term effects of both. As you go throughout the day and you eat meals or you exercise, is there an impact on your ability to take in new information when you're tired versus not tired, or whether you're hungry or you've just eaten a meal?
Yeah, I think that there's reasonable evidence of the short-term effects. Some of it is in some ways better than the long-term effects because it's easier to control those studies, where there are so many factors that might go in if you have a study over a long period of time. And certainly fatigue is related to cognitive performance and even time of day. So, we find, and a lot of studies have found that some people, due to changes in the circadian rhythm, have an ideal time of day when they perform, and these things seem less variable. So in addition to the type of more long-term changes we're seeing, I agree. I think that healthy living throughout a day in terms of sleep and diet and exercise all affect cognition.
So it goes without saying that the follow-up to that is, so how healthy are you? Do you exercise every day? What do you eat? 2 months ago, we had somebody come in and talk about the toxicology of cleaners and everyday household products. So naturally, we asked what he cleans with. Yeah. He said soap. So we hold you to high regard for.
Yeah, I try for 5 days a week. Don't always reach it, but I do exercise every day. We have a gym on our campus right over here at UCSF, and I eat better and better all the time. Thanks to my nutritional consult over there. I definitely do try to live it. I think it makes a big difference. I'm reaching 40 this year, and I think that it's more obvious to me now how important it is to really live by these principles as you get older.
I've been involved in the evaluation, actually, with the UCSF School of Nursing on the impact of video games on cognition, and have been involved in video game evaluation for a while. And one of the tenets of looking at the impact of games on different age groups is learning methodology and instructional design. Obviously, you would design a game for a 50-year-old differently than you would for a 15-year-old. And a lot of what we see in effectiveness has to come from instructional methods and adults really applying more experiential elements than younger kids. So with respect to the kinds of tests that when you're looking at the brain and you're looking at aging and cognition and suppression and all these terminologies, how do you take into account the fact that we as adults, I'm sitting here and maybe someone younger is processing this information way a lot differently than I am. I'm, connecting it to things 50 years ago, and you probably haven't even been alive 50 years. So how do you factor in those, differences in learning processes, methodologies when you're assessing brain function in your lab and elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It's really, really challenging. We have, before any of our experiments, we have a period of practice until we feel that the participant and we feel that they've reached a level. Our experiments are not all that complicated. We tend to do more simple experiments, unlike some labs, some of my colleagues' experiments that I don't know how anyone does these experiments. It's so complicated. But I really like to have very sort of elegant, simple experiments. And part of it is because when you're studying aging, you want to try to eliminate all those variables. But there are other things that could affect performance other than changes in the brain and aging, such as not just how long it may take practice, but strategies that people use. And we try to restrain the strategies all the time by defining exactly how we want the experiment done and its limitations. And still even there, we're often left not knowing. And then we do other experiments to constrain them further. So one of my colleagues did a version of my experiment where they tell you how to remember it. So some people remember faces by trying to remember a feature, and other people sort of get this holistic impression. And so we have one version where you have to remember features, and we tell you to another where your goal is to remember holistic features, and same things with scenes. So there's no easy answer, but that is what we spend a lot of time debating. Have we constrained all these effects of practice and learning and strategies that differ between our groups? So it's definitely a good point that I glossed over, but we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And certainly in the guise of designing brain training programs, and like I said, we're trying to design a program that we want to be very much like a game in the fact that it's fun to play and people want to do it as opposed to just feeling like they're training. They feel like it's fun and something that they're excited about. And these are definitely considerations that we're looking into.
My question kind of goes along with his, is how suppression is different between generations, but how do you know that's not because of the different generations? Like 50 years ago, there was no internet, but like now there's pop-up windows, IMs, like email coming all the time, and so younger people just adapted to that and know how to ignore it?
Yeah, this is the pitfalls of a cross-sectional study like we did, and most people do. Right, so we took one group that's older and one group that's younger. We see a difference, and we say this is an aging effect. And it's reasonable that might be true, but it's also that these groups are very different. The ideal way is to do a longitudinal studies, right, to take a group of 20-year-olds and then follow them throughout their lives and see if they develop a suppression deficit. But of course, it would take the rest of my life to do that study, so we don't have that data. But we do hope to follow a lot of our older subjects, and this is so the people that were in the study that I showed you did this experiment 4 years ago, and we're just now, actually just yesterday, we were having a conversation about bringing them back and seeing if the suppression deficit got worse, which would give us at least a little snapshot over someone's short, time span of 5 years that these things change with time.
I think that it's very interesting that you've done all this work with visual processing, but you mentioned that you've done also some work with auditory, and I just wonder if that area, the prefrontal cortex, or if the prefrontal cortex itself has any role as a gatekeeper for auditory, because there are people, personally, I can't read a book or do anything with radio in the background. But I actually know people who can't read a book or do anything unless there is a radio playing in the background.
Yeah, that's great. So I have that experiment is on my list. I have a long list of sort of more ambitious experiments, and I call that the coffee shop experiment. And the idea is to go into a coffee shop and recruit all these people that feel like they can't work anywhere else besides like banging noises and people talking, and then go into a library and find that exact opposite group and then study them and see, is one group better at suppressing? There's also this other interesting aspect of suppression that, but these people, and I think I was one of those people more at one time, although I do still do a lot of work in coffee shops, I think that it seems that there's something about suppressing the outside world that feels like it gives a benefit in internal focus. In other words, if you didn't have something outside to suppress, you'd have a lot more internal things that were sort of disrupting your thinking. That's just a hunch, but that's the type of thing we want to study, is to see if the actual need to suppress can offer some sort of advantage for those people. It's very likely that those people would do much better if they just left the coffee shop and went to a library. And they just enjoy working at coffee shops, and so they feel that it gives them advantage. That might be what we find. And back to your first question of the prefrontal cortex and auditory. So the prefrontal cortex is more of a general gatekeeper, and it's what we call domain independent. So it probably affects how you process the perceptual world for every modality. So for vision and auditory and tactile, that it acts to suppress all of those types of information that are irrelevant. That's one thing that we're interested in, is are there different parts of the prefrontal cortex? I also mentioned that it's not just suppressing the sensory world, but also suppressing internal things like emotions. And there are connections between the prefrontal cortex and areas like the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which are involved in both emotional thoughts and also the autonomic expression of emotions. So, the prefrontal cortex and its role in control is very broad, and it's not necessarily specific.
So before we take one more question, you mentioned experiments that you want to do. So I'm going to ask you a really difficult question. Now, fast forward 5 years. Where are you going to be in terms of your research? What is it that you'd like to attack? And where is this field going?
Yeah, I can't give you all my secrets now, but you have no reason to invite me back.
I think people can promise that they're not going to go after this cafe, buy a $3 million machine.
As long as everyone signs something on the way out. I think right now we've done a lot of work in pulling apart these different concepts like suppression and enhancement and showing how they change. We have probably 12 experiments in the lab going on now, pulling apart more details of this. So for instance, another experiment that we're doing, we call it the eyes wide shut experiment. This is not published, it's still in process, so again, don't use your fMRI scanner and do this and beat me to it. But the idea is that it's not just suppressing information in the world around you that prevents you from taking in new information, that this occurs all the time when you're trying to remember things. So I asked a very simple question: what would happen? How would you be able to remember something, let's say what you had for dinner the night before, if your eyes were open or if your eyes were closed? What do you think? So we asked this question, and most people think closed. And I sort of started getting this idea because when you ask someone this question, what did you have for dinner last night, they tend to look away from you, like you're distracting them just by looking at you. So I was like, So we searched the literature, and apparently no one has ever done this experiment. So we've started doing it, and we've been through a series of people, and what we could see now is that, as a matter of fact, you do remember things better with your eyes closed than open. And now we're exploring the brain mechanisms of suppressing and how that occurs. And maybe some people do really well, and that's just because they could suppress, they could just shut out the world. And this maybe even impacts older folks when they have the experience of trying to retrieve information. But as far as a broader answer to your question of 5 years from now, I guess how I started saying that we've pulled out a lot of these details about how we process information, and now I'm really interested in trying to use this to help people and help the quality of their lives by using this information to design interventions. So the training program is definitely one of my main focuses now, and I think it'll take us years to really get that going.
I have a question about things that harm the brain. Given that we now know that every one of us here in this room carries a fairly hefty burden of synthetic chemicals. Most of the people in this room were probably born with synthetic chemicals. I can't imagine that it doesn't affect the brain in some way, particularly aging and forms of dementia. Have you been doing any work around that?
We have not. I don't actually know many people that are, but I agree. It's an important thing not to forget, is that there's not just good things, but there are things that need to be avoided and things that we have not avoided and can avoid. And there's certainly things including even things like mercury levels that could contribute to changes in the brain. We have not looked at it, but I do think it's important.
So I have a unique question for the audience. What would you like to see Adam work on from here? This is their chance to direct your research because, hey, we're paying for it, right? Because where does the bulk of your funding come from?
So there are three general ways that you get funded when you're a scientific lab like mine at an academic center. The most common and the largest is federal funding, usually through the NIH if it's biology. So there you are paying for the bulk of most of our research, including mine. And then there are foundations, and then there are very generous people that have money and would like to see it help people. And then there is industry that are designing and trying to work on their own products and would like to move science along. So
okay, so this is our chance. We actually have somebody that we're paying to do research on memory. So what is it that you would like to see researched on memory? What do you want to find out for yourself? Environmental toxins? Design a pill to stop Alzheimer's? Does that affect your life personally? Is that why you said that? With your parent. I think you quoted a stat at the beginning, 80% of people?
50%.
50%, I'm sorry.
People have rated. The Alzheimer's disease research is at a pretty exciting time right now. You may be aware, but all of the medications that we have for Alzheimer's now, although they do give some advantage, don't change the underlying disease, right? The disease of Alzheimer's is relentless, and the medications we do give you a boost, but they don't stop the disease. And now there's a tremendous amount of research we call disease-modifying agents that are working on the pathology that causes Alzheimer's disease. So I'm optimistic that over the next 5 years we'll see some really nice medications.
So I can't help but think that tracking gaze would be interesting information to collect in addition to what you're doing, seeing where people look on the picture. Just as
it's great. We do that on some of our experiments. So we have an eye tracker inside the scanner where we can look at where the eyes are moving, and that's great. It's another great piece of data that we use a lot.
Go ahead.
Coffee. The effect of coffee on
the effect of coffee. How does coffee affect you on a daily basis, Miss? This is my wife, so I think I know. I actually know.
Makes you very happy, but distracted, and
Yeah, I haven't seen any studies of coffee and the type of top-down control that we're looking at, so it would just be a guess. But I mean, I think often stimulation comes with a consequence always, and some of it might be lack of focus, and that might play on these systems. That's just a guess.
There's good data that coffee helps cognitive abilities first, and then second, I would like to see more data on how nutrition, daily nutrition, and just food, not supplements, which never ever work, affects cognitive aging.
That's great.
Thanks. Being one of the over 50 crowd here, I started about 3 years ago on omega-3 that he was talking about, omega-3 and 6, and it's made quite a bit of difference, along with some of the other items that are under the study done out in Berkeley about mitochondrial aging, so the ALA, ACLA, changing your vitamin D3 to be 1,500 IU a day. These things actually make a lot of difference. But on the other hand, when it's made a significant difference in your life over a period of 3 years, it's like, I'm not going to ignore the evidence,
Well, there's clinical trials.
The clinical trials are there, right?
Here, I'll highlight the discussion. Here's my own take on that discussion. So there's a gentleman here who's had positive effects by changing his nutritional diet using supplements and other methodologies.
Well-grounded in science, right?
Well-grounded in science, okay. And the nutritional consultant, am I right? Is it right? It says there are not many clinical studies that clinical trials that confirm that over a large populace. We've reached this place before. Every month we reach this place. This is the difference between science and experience that we always come to in this place. And it always comes up as you have your own personal experience, and then there is what is reproducible over a large populace. So we're back at the same discussion again. So without
the actual experiments done on dogs,
have real experimental data.
So he disagrees with me, and the gentleman disagrees to some extent that there can be some experimental proof provided, and I think that's true. It's just at this point, the large populace doesn't agree.
On humans within Adam's lab.
So other ideas, other ways you want Adam to. What do you want Adam to do? I can say I think the biggest change that I would love to see is some way for more people to be empowered about controlling their own memory. And that's what I see you doing in terms of these games and non-interventional ways for people to feel like they're in control of their own aging cycle. I think that would be a huge help for me as I go day to day, as I go year to year, thinking about I have no control over this. I'm just aging, is the conclusion I always reach.
Yeah, I think just the sign of how many people are here, and I've been giving more public talks lately, and they're always packed, and I think people are interested in how their brain is changing as they age, and it's not just older people, it's younger people, and that's changing all the time. So, the way we look at it is different now, and people want to be in control, and I think it's exciting. For me, it's really gratifying that the research we do is so interesting to people, and I think it's encouraging to know that even young people realize that their brains are changing and that there might be ways to help.
Well, on our wish list, I'd like to add studies of how to improve, young people's higher cognitive functions, analysis, critical thinking, synthetic, global. Because I have a stepdaughter who doesn't know how to do sophisticated reasoning. Period. Now she has a series of diagnosed learning disabilities. But what can you do? Is there anything? I'd love you to study that and fix her brain and everybody else's brain who suffers from the same problem.
There is a theme of fixing things.
I think it'd be great if you could apply some of your work in public education and how it can, study instructors, study the methods of education and how physiologically what's going on or not going on in those classrooms.
We'll take a couple more.
I just want to follow up with that earlier question about caffeine. Do you personally, do you drink coffee or tea? Do you recommend coffee or tea? And do you document coffee or tea or other caffeinated beverages for your test subjects?
Personally, I drink it sometimes. I definitely do not drink it every day. I was a medical resident, and almost everyone I knew was entirely and completely addicted to tremendous amounts of coffee, and it freaked me out. So I was like, I'll just be tired and not feel that addicted. So somehow I've managed to go through my life without being addicted to coffee. Sometimes I do drink it. Sometimes I drink decaf. We don't really control our subjects' coffee consumption, although we do try to tell people not to drink coffee before our scans, because there are studies that show that even things like caffeine could change the blood flow rate, and this could be a confound in our experiments. In terms of general recommendations, I don't really have very many strong ones.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question is, seeing how meditation is an exercise of focusing the mind, I was curious, is there any research or general interest on the correlation between meditation and improving memory?
Yeah, there is research on that. I think it's fascinating on the ability to control. Meditation is a control exercise. It's not really a passive process, as most people probably realize. And I think it's fascinating. There are some studies, even fMRI studies and EEG studies, that have looked at meditation and tried to understand what are the processes that are going on. And it's something that I would very much be interested in doing at some point.
To answer that question, I had a science cafe last year about that. You can go on YouTube and watch the video of it. And I actually took a part in an fMRI study on meditation as a methodology. And I wrote about my experience on sciencecafesf.com. So you're welcome to go read about what it's like to be involved in this and sit in a machine for a couple hours. while they replay some of your worst memories to you on a little screen. So a couple more questions.
What are some truths and myths about ginkgo biloba?
So ginkgo is a supplement, it's found in the tree, as I'm sure you realize, that has been associated with cognitive impairment. There's actually was some reasonable, I haven't looked at this literature in a long time, but there are actually some reasonable studies that came out early that showed some reasonable effects, modest, but seemed to be significant from some clinical studies. And a lot of those individuals had memory impairment. I don't think they're quite as convincing in people that didn't have impairment. So the last time I looked was many years ago when it was sort of the craze, and it seemed like some of it was actually fairly well done.
Okay, one more question, right?
You seem to be working with, I guess, the Posit Sciences and those types of people over there. How much of that work is in sort of evaluating things they come up with, and how much of it is more into design, saying there's this scientific fact, what can be designed to make it work around that?
From my perspective? So we do both. So the study that we're doing with Posit right now is that, okay, you design something, we're going to take it and evaluate it and see and test it before and after. But what I'm working on now is designing our own intervention based on our research about the suppression deficit and trying to use what we know about the brain and how it changes to design something and then use our tools to test it and see if it does work.
All right, we're almost at time, so we're going to take one more question, and we're going to give you an opportunity to sort of wrap this up with a little bow that we'll neatly forget tomorrow.
I just wanted to go back to that Posit Science stuff a little bit. I mean, one of the questions certainly is all of the stuff that seems to be out there is being put forth by the people who are doing the research. And is there any independent research going on to test it and prove it?
Well, we're independent. I mean, we certainly don't have any stake in Posit at all. We just think that they have a nice intervention. You know, so we would be an example of an academic lab that is looking at many different types of interventions, including pharmacological ones, and seeing what's changing. I think it's really important that other places, I mean, Posit was delighted. We approached them and said that we wanted to evaluate it with one of our tools, and more than to even see if it works, it's to see how it works, even in some people. So I agree that that's really important to be done.
So first, before we wrap up, I want to thank you dearly for coming out. I think it's a rare feat for a scientist to come to a bar on a Monday night and just talk shop with everyone. And I really appreciate, first of all, just allowing us to actually contribute to you and actually tell you what we want and actually listening to us. I think that's even rarer, especially as we come to the election. So thank you very much. So this is your chance to leave us with a golden nugget and maybe publicize some ways that you can garner us into your research. Pull us in.
Well, that's a good thing to say. I have nothing left to say. Well, I thank you for coming down. It's becoming increasingly obvious to me that one of our goals as a scientist, which we don't often accomplish, is to really communicate what we do to the people that are benefiting or have the potential benefit and the people that pay for it. So it's something that I'm enjoying doing more and more, and I thank you for coming and being interested. As far as how you can help, I think that would be a great thing, especially if the people here, if this is a reflection of how interested you are in this. There's lots of studies in our own lab, but also many labs around the Bay Area. We have tons of colleagues at Berkeley, different types of experiments, not just the ones on memory and attention, but anxiety and Berkeley lab. Yeah, there you go. Jeff deserves a plug. And including Stanford and many places, outside of the city. So if you are interested in our research, we have a website, gazzaley.ucsf.edu, and you could read about our research. All our papers are on there. You could download any of the basic science publications, and we'll probably put some clips from some more general talks that I've been giving. And if you're interested, you could sign up and email us to come down to the lab and volunteer. If it's interesting to you, I think you'd enjoy being in one of the studies, or at least the experience is certainly worthwhile to some people. So.
Awesome. I'll put all of that information up on my website, sciencecafesf.com. You'll be able to watch the video from tonight. There'll be a link to Adam's lab and how to participate. There's even a story on Wired Science about somebody that participated in a study here about a year ago. I think they were in the EEG study, if I'm not mistaken. And links to other papers and other labs that are looking for studies. Actually, a former speaker, Dr. Philippe Golden, just sent me an email yesterday seeing if anyone wanted to participate in a meditation study. So there are plenty of opportunities out there. I encourage everyone to do it after my experience. Don't do the nutrition study. That's what I'll say. That's too much work. Do these. These are quick, in and out. So thank you again for coming out and making this all possible. This is a monthly series. We're here the third Monday of every month. Next month we'll be talking about nuclear power. If you were watching the debate last week, John McCain came out and said we can just add 40 nuclear plants and our energy problem will be solved. So this is a chance to ask an expert if that's so, and what are the pitfalls and positives of going forward with it. If you haven't signed up on the email sign-up sheet, it's still going around. There's a donation jar up near the cash register. I encourage you to put some money in if you feel like you had a great time tonight. And that's about it. One last big hand for Hannah.